Today, we're concluding our 5-part homily series called In the Desert. In week 1, I spoke about temptations in the desert. In week 2, Father Ronald spoke on confession. Week 3, I talked about forgiveness, and that forgiveness is that two-way street for us. Last week, Father Ronald spoke about community, and today I want to talk about new life. I had some opportunity recently to spend some time in a desert. We did some great hiking, and at times, when you're in the desert, it can seem to be a pretty unforgiving place. Driving through or looking at a desert from a distance, it can seem to just be a stark collection of browns and grays. But if you stop and get out of the car and begin to walk through it, you can see beautiful shades of red or white rock. You can see spring flowers budding up. Occasionally, you might come across a running river, and if you look hard enough, you can find even natural hot springs sandwiched between two mountains. In all of this, you can find that theme of new life, but you got to work at it. You got to you got to do your part. You got to get out of the car and begin to walk. A few weeks ago, I saw on the Oscars on TV, and I watched just a little bit of it, but you've seen this scene on the Oscars many times. Some actor gets up, she just received the Oscar, and she walks up to the stand, and she's at the podium, and she's all smiles, and she begins her speech. I'd like to thank the Academy. I'd like to thank my family. I want to thank the producers and the rest of the cast, and on the speech goes. And every so often she'll say something like, I also want to thank God for this. It happens in sports too. The quarterback has just been named the MVP, and he gives his thanks to his parents, to his coaches, to his players, and every so often you'll hear one of them thank God for the talent that they have. Most of the time when I hear people thanking God in those situations, I think it's genuine. I think most people, those famous and those of us who are not, I think most people give God at least some credit for the successes we have in our life. We thank God for the blessings of our life. And most of us give credit to others as well. We credit our families, we credit our parents, our friends, our spouses, our children. I found myself thinking about all this as I reflected on the story of Lazarus, because it would seem to me that this story illustrates well how God works in our lives. For this miracle to take place, 3 things have to happen. God has to do God's part, Lazarus has to do Lazarus's part, and Lazarus's family and friends do their part. And it's within that context that I want to explore our gospel reading today. First of all, God does his part. Jesus shows up at the tomb a little later than Martha and Mary might have wished, but he shows up, and he comes to offer new life to Lazarus. Jesus lifts his eyes to heaven, he prays his prayer, he works his miracle, and then he beckons, Lazarus, come out. Lazarus, I have new life in store for you. The good news here is that we can be confident that God will always do God's part. God wants us to have new life. He says in John 10:10, I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. And so in our gospel story today, Jesus does his part as he says, Lazarus, come out. I have new life for you. And that's where Jesus' part stops. And Lazarus must now do his part. Lazarus must decide whether or not to come out. Now, you might think that would be an easy decision, but I'm not so sure. You see, I think there are lots of things that entomb each one of us. They wrap themselves around us, they envelop us. Lots of things that keep us from really living, things that bind us to an old life rather than going forth into new life. One of my cyberspace friends wrote this on the website this week. I stood at the gravesite of my beloved daddy 3 years ago this Thursday. I prayed that God would set him free, that God would call him out of the tomb, but it didn't happen. I know right now, as I prepare to preach this weekend, I'm more focused on death than on life. I just pray that I can offer some message of hope. I think sometimes when we lose a loved one to death, we can be buried right there with them. And sometimes we can refuse to come out of that tomb. I was talking the other day with a man who's an alcoholic. He was talking about his need to quit, and he told me that his need to quit is strong But he said, but right now, Father, the desire to drink is even stronger. I think sometimes our addictions can become like a tomb, one from which sometimes we refuse to come out. In both of those cases, the entombment comes from within. Someone's struggle to deal with the death of a loved one can seem like a tomb that envelops them completely. Someone giving in to the entombment of addiction may feel unable to break free from its chains. It's not easy to come out of the tomb. As strange as it sounds to us, the journey to new life is not always easy. But Lazarus did his part. He came out. So Jesus did his part. Lazarus did his part. But there was one part left to be done. Lazarus' family and friends had to do their part, untie him and let him go free. If the family and friends of Lazarus had not done their part, if they had left Lazarus bound by those burial cloths, he would never have been set free from the tomb. But they did untie him, and they did let him go, and so the miracle was complete. God doing God's part, Lazarus doing his part, and their family and friends doing their part. Perhaps one of the greatest lessons in this story of Lazarus is that it reminds us that if we want to be set free from whatever it is that entombs us, if we want that new life that God offers to us, that life with Jesus that begins in the desert of Lent but ends with the joy of Easter and the resurrection, we need to involve God, but we also need to involve others as well. We can't do it alone. When my cyberspace friend wrote about 3 years ago that she prayed at her father's tomb that God would open the grave, she went on to write this: God did not call him out of the tomb, but he calls me out of mine. I have a friend who challenged me to see how I was so busy grieving over my dad's death that I had quit living. I have a friend, she writes. I have a friend. God did his part, she was doing her part, and her friend was doing his part. I have a friend who's a drug addict. She tried numerous times to quit on her own, but she never could. But when she joined NA, Narcotics Anonymous, when she found the support of friends, it finally worked for her. She's been sober now for 30 plus years. God did his part. God called my friend out of the tomb of addiction. My friend did her part. She had the courage to walk into that first NA meeting, and then her friends in NA did their part. They helped untie her so that she could be free. Perhaps as you hear this story today, you find yourself in some tomb. Maybe it's a tomb of addiction. Maybe it's a tomb of self-doubt. Maybe it's a tomb of death. Maybe it's a tomb of a failed relationship. Whatever the tomb, listen closely for a God who calls you by name, who tells you, come out, I have new life for you. Listen closely for a God who calls you to that new life. And then you have a decision to make. Stay in the tomb or walk out of it. Or perhaps as you listen to this story today, you are people waiting by the tomb, waiting for your friend to come out. Can you help them? Maybe it's your job to untie them so that they can be free. Wherever you find yourself today, just remember it takes everyone working together, us doing our part, our friends doing their part, and God doing God's part. And when all that happens, we receive the gift that we celebrate completely in just 2 short weeks. We receive that gift of new life.